Okay, so my name is RJ Heijmen. I am my title's insanely long, Senior Associate Rector for Adult Education, Stewardship, and Student Ministries. And in addition to that, I do the regular sort of pastoral things around here, marry people, bury people, do baptisms. I visit the hospitals once a week, which I really enjoy. That's a good way to keep you grounded in reality. Coming up on my 17th wedding anniversary, which just sounds insane to me. My wife, Jamie, is from originally California. I'm from Connecticut. We both went to UC Berkeley, but met in coat check line at a dance club in New York City. And if you ever lived in New York, a place called Limelight, which is notorious for all the wrong reasons, but hey, that's where we met. That's our story. We have two sons. Jackson is an 8th grader. Spencer is a 5th grader, and then actually we just found out we're pregnant again, which is insane. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'm gonna need a lot of encouragement. Just kidding. No, we're really excited. So my wife is due. She actually just told me, I think she has had 2 C-sections. So the next one's scheduled for September 16th, and it's another little boy, and everything is good. So she's like 16 weeks along, and this child will have 4 parents and a lot of built-in babysitting, and there you have it. Praise God. Well, this is a topic, burning out in the pursuit of happiness, I've been thinking about a lot. Because we just live in a culture where there is so much pressure. And I remember I was listening to the Diane Rehm show. Anyone listen to that on NPR in the morning? There was an author, a poet, I think Andre Dubose III, I think was his name, and they were talking about sort of the phenomenon and the cultural imperative of happiness in America, and about how we live in a country where you just have to be happy all the time. And if you're not, then you're violating some sort of cultural taboo, cultural law. He tied it back to the Declaration of Independence, right? Like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And especially for people who seem to have it all, who are doing okay, and their kids are basically okay, and they have enough money, and they have good jobs, and they got a nice house, and all that sort of stuff. You really feel like you should be happy, and then when you're not happy, you got to deal with the fact that you're not happy, and then the guilt over not feeling happy as well. And this guy was saying he just felt like that was all just kind of a crock, that life is hard a lot of the times, even for people who seem to have it all. Things happen, people get sick, jobs get lost, anxiety, depression. As my seminary dean used to say, you're only as happy as your least happy child. Or remember that Steve Martin movie Parenthood from maybe like 20 years ago? My wife and I have watched that both times the night before she went in for her C-section. It's so great. But I remember his father complaining about how parenthood never ends. Like you think there's a finish line, and then you realize there's no finish line, and it just goes on and on and on. And I can say this in this setting because I'm at the Hope and Healing Center. I can be a little more risque. He says, what does he say? He says, it's like your Aunt Edna's ass. It goes on forever and is just as scary. So yeah, hey, why not? I'm not in Bagby. I'm at the HHC. We can roll a little looser here. But that's a terrifying thing, right? Because part of me is like, oh, the kids will go to college, and then and then it'll be, empty nesters, and woo, everything will be fine. But that's not true if you love your children. And so this whole thing of like needing to be happy all the time is really destructive. It's incredibly destructive, and I think there was nothing in our culture that captured that more perfectly than. Have you guys seen Inside Out? Raise your hand if you have not seen Inside Out. That is just shameful. You should be ashamed of yourselves. It's incredible. We're in a golden age of television. I also think with Pixar over the last 20 years, we're in a golden age of animated cinema equal to or greater than kind of the Disney movies of the 30s and 40s. But Inside Out is amazing because it's all about the cultural imperative to happiness and how it will completely ruin your life, and how you have to be free to be sad sometimes, and that you can't be happy without being sad, and that if you just try to be happy all the time, it'll kill you or turn you into an emotional zombie, right? And I just think it captures it so perfectly. We went to go see the movie in the theater, and my wife, as she always does, fell asleep 5 minutes in, and woke up 5 minutes from the end. And when she woke up, it was like right at the end, like right after the catharsis, and then the comedy comes in and everyone's laughing, and she looks over at me and I'm just like weeping like a baby. And she's like, "RJ, what is your problem?" But then we watched it again at home, and the waterworks were just insane. Because if you've ever experienced disappointment, heartache, sadness, especially with your children, because you have these babies and you just want them to be perfectly happy for all time. So if they've experienced disappointment and you felt like it was at all your fault, you just can't help but have a cathartic moment watching this movie. So go home, rent it, buy it, watch it, cry, feel better. Incidentally, the guy who I think directed and co-wrote it, Pete Docter, my wife used to babysit his kids when we lived in Berkeley because they went to our church. And so, you've got a lot of very insightful, connected people who are writing these movies, and there's just a tremendous amount of wisdom in Pixar films. So that's kind of something I've been thinking about. But then I brought a lot here. Here are the resources I brought today, and I'll mention all those. But I want to start, after talking about In and Out, by just reading a little bit from a recent New York Times article called, and we're going to go a little nuclear here, we're going to go a little bit heavy, but I think it's a good place to start, and then we can back off from it a little bit. But it's called Suicide on Campus and the Pressure of Perfection. And I'm going to read just a couple pages of this to kind of set the scene. Catherine DeWitt conquered high school like a gold medal decathlete. She ran track, represented her school at a statewide girls' leadership program, and took 8 advanced placement tests, including one for which she independently prepared, foregoing the class. Expectations were high. Every day at 5 p.m., test scores and updated grades were posted online. Her mother would be the first to comment should her grade go down. Quote, "I would get home from track and she would say, 'I see your grade dropped.' I would say, 'Mom, I think it's a mistake.' And she would say, 'That's what I thought.'" Unquote. The reason turned out to be typing errors. Miss DeWitt graduated with straight A's. In her first 2 weeks at the University of Pennsylvania campus, she hustled. She joined a co-ed fraternity, signed up to tutor elementary school students, and joined the same Christian group her parents had joined at their alma mater, Stanford. But having gained admittance off the waitlist and surrounded by people with seemingly greater drive and ability, she had her first taste of self-doubt. Quote, "One friend was a world-class figure skater. Another was a winner of the Intel science competition. Everyone around me was so spectacular and so amazing, and I wanted to be just as amazing as they are." Unquote. Classmates seemed to have it all together. Every morning, the administration sent out an email blast highlighting faculty and student accomplishments. Some women attended class wearing full makeup. Miss DeWitt had acne. They talked about their fantastic internships. She was still focused on the week's homework. Friends' lives, as told through selfies, showed them having more fun, making more friends, and going to better parties. Even the meals they posted to Instagram looked more delicious. Her confidence took another hit when she glanced at the cell phone screen of a male student sitting next to her who was texting that he would, quote, rather jump out of a plane, quote, than talk to his seatmate. That's brutal. When on January 14th, 2014, Madison Holleran, another Penn freshman, jumped off the top of a parking garage and killed herself, Miss DeWitt was stunned. She had never met Miss Holleran, but she knew the student was popular, attractive, and talented. In a blog post soon afterward, Miss DeWitt would write, "What the hell, girl? I was supposed to be the one who went first. You had so much to live for." Despite her cheery countenance and assiduous completion of assignments, Miss DeWitt had already bought razor blades and written a stack of goodbye letters to loved ones. Miss Holleran was the third of 6 Penn students to commit suicide in a 13-month stretch. And the school is far from the only one to experience a so-called suicide cluster. This school year, Tulane lost 4 students, and Appalachian State at least 3. The disappearance in September of a freshman, Anna M. Smith, led to an 11-day search before she was found in the North Carolina woods hanging from a tree. Cornell faced 6 suicides in the 2009-10 academic year. In 2003-04, 5 New York University students leapt to their deaths. Nationally, the suicide rate among 15 to 24-year-olds has increased modestly but steadily from about 10 per 100,000 in 2007 to 11 in 2013. But a survey of college counseling centers has found that more than half their clients have severe psychological problems, an increase of 13% in just 2 years. Anxiety and depression, in that order, are now the most common mental health diagnoses among college students, according to the Center for Collegiate Mental Health at Penn State. So that's sobering, right? And it's not just colleges, it's high schools. And it's not just colleges, it's 20-somethings and 30-somethings and 40-somethings. In fact, the CDC says over the last 10 to 15 years, middle-aged, kind of, middle class, upper middle class men and women are far and away the fastest growing of the, suicide segment of the suicide population. And my guess is all or most of us know someone that this has affected. And I'm not, I was going to have a disclaimer later, but I'll make it now here. I'm not a mental health professional, and so I'm not an expert in mental health, anxiety, depression, chemical issues, all that sort of stuff. But to me, there has to be some sort of connection between our culture's relentless positivity and these types of disorders, right? There just has to be. And so that's what I want to talk about, that the pressure is real. The pressure that your kids are living under, the pressure that you're living under. I remember talking to Matt Stanford, who's the director here at the HHC, and he said, when I was coming out of school, he's probably in his 50s, he said, no one expected you to be reading out of kindergarten. And now, of course, everyone is. Except apparently in Finland, which has the best educational system in the world, which I'm sure you heard, no one expects you to read till you're 8. So clearly there are other ways to do it. But the pressure is real, and I also think it's based on something real in our culture, that it's not just all made up. That if you look at Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, this very real sense that there's this growing, the middle class is dying, right? That there's this growing gap between those who've made it and those who haven't. And as the middle class seems to sort of thin out, and you're either going to be a superstar, you're either going to be the best or you're going to struggle, we want our kids to be on the right end of that equation. I remember even, 20 years ago when a little less than 20 years ago, around the time I graduated from college, I was talking with a friend at a wedding, and we were talking about job possibilities and what we were going to do and the income gap and everything. And of course, I was talking about, we got to change this, which is ridiculous. And he was saying, I just want to make sure I'm on the right end of that equation, the right side of that gap. And so I don't think it's as bad as the media makes it out to be, but certainly there's something in our culture that says it's more and more difficult to trust that everything's basically going to be okay with your kids, right? Because we see that the middle class just isn't quite there anymore, and you're either going to be upper or upper middle, or you're going to be lower or lower middle. And we all want to make sure that our kids do well, and that there's fear involved. And I also want to say that I'm not a neutral observer on these topics. Today is a really interesting day for me to be doing this, because not only do we have to make a decision today about where our 5th grader is going to go to school next year. It's April 6th. I'm sure some of you are making those decisions too. But this morning we had a parent-teacher conference with our 8th grader at his school, which he kind of led, and a lot of it was talking about high school and things he wants to do better, and things he's interested in, and what he might want to do. And I just found myself in this weird position where he's a great kid. He's smart, he's hardworking, he's got a good head on his shoulders, and part of me just wants to say, you're going to be fine, I love you, it's all going to be fine. And the other part wants to be but make sure you're differentiating yourself and working hard and finding what your passion is, and all this stuff that I wasn't thinking about when I was in 8th grade. You know what I mean? And so I'm not dispassionate, and my wife and I talk about this all the time. Are we doing a good job? Are we overburdening our kids? Are we too involved? Are we not involved enough? Is there too much pressure? Is there not enough pressure? And so I think we're living probably where some of you are living as well. It matters who your kid is, what kind of education they get, and even beyond where they go to school. It's not about credentialism, as what's his name, William Dershowitz calls in his book, Excellent Sheep, that we're a culture who's become obsessed with credentialism at the expense of our children's souls. And don't worry, I'll put this up. Oh no, that's a different book. This is the book, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, that some of you may have heard of this, that my buddy who worked in admissions recommended, which is all about, we live in this world where you better go to one of the top 4, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, or one of the top 12, or one of the Ivies, or whatever. But the reality is, what's her name? Elizabeth Warren went to the University of Houston. Like, give me a break, Chris Christie, and this was just politics. He goes through a lot of different fields. Chris Christie and Joe Biden went to Delaware. That this whole myth that you have to go to one of these top schools in order to be the president of a Fortune 500 company or to make it in politics or to do any of those things is just absurd. I even think about when I was in New York City doing youth ministry, one of the kids I ministered to, his father was the head of municipal bonds for a large investment bank. One of the ones which didn't make it to the investment, the crisis, but he had nothing to do with that. But he went to Bob Jones University. Remember Bob Jones University, where until recently, black and white people apparently weren't allowed to hold hands? Now, he wasn't a racist, but I'm saying it was a insanely small, very fundy, southern, not the type of place that you expect the head of a major department at a major New York investment bank to have gone to college. And so it's all kind of a lie. And he even says the media perpetuates this lie, right? Just even this morning, did you guys hear, I listen to NPR, sue me. But this morning was talking about how Sylvester Turner just named his new legal counsel, right? Who used to work at Baker Botts and then started his own law firm, and now he's going to be for the city. But they made to say Harvard graduate, blah, 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 blah. Now, if he'd gone to I don't know where, would they have mentioned where he went to school? Probably not, right? And that's what he says, that if someone went to Harvard or Princeton or Stanford or Yale or MIT or any one of these, the golden dozen or whatever you want to call them, then it gets mentioned. But if they didn't, it doesn't. Or it gets mentioned as an obstacle they had to overcome. So it's just kind of absurd. So if you're freaked out or your kids are freaked out about, the connection between where you went to college and how successful you're going to be in life, check that book out. That's a good book. Where am I? So I read that. I felt better. I talked to my friend. But then, I picked up this book, When Breath Becomes Air. Anyone heard about this book? I have a slide for this as well. It's written by Dr. Paul Kalanithi, who was a 36-year-old Stanford-trained neurosurgeon who also did things in English literature and robotics. And he wrote this book because just as he was finishing up his final residency internship, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know all the training, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer and ended up dying at 36 or 37. So he wrote this book as a reflection on his life and all that he had done and all the work he'd put in as he was coming to the end of his life. And he comes back to his Christian faith as well, because that's what you do. You're looking for something when tragedy hits. But he was describing his childhood, and he had been living in Westchester County outside New York City, and his older brother had gone to Stanford, and then his father was a doctor, and his father wanted to be in charge of his own practice. And so he moved the family to Kingman, Arizona, which apparently has the worst public school system in the United States of America. And his mom kind of freaked out, and so she got on the PTA, and she got a list of 25 books that every college student should read, and he read them, and of course, he ended up getting into Stanford from this totally terrible school system. And I was thrown right back into that place of anxiety where well, maybe we should pull my 8th grader out of St. John's and put him somewhere else, because then he would be, he'd have more free time to read, and he could develop the whole person, and he could, he'd be more of a big fish in a small pond. And it's absurd. All these, I'm sure none of you guys do that, right? You're all, none of you are like me. You're all totally secure and fine. But I just say that all to say I'm thinking about these things, that it's not abstraction for me. And although I'm not an expert, I'm a dad and a son. I'm thinking about also my own upbringing and how that's affected who I am right now. And I'm a husband. And what I would say I'm an expert in is Christianity, is the Bible. And I do think that Jesus has some resources to offer us in this space. And I think it's striking, one of the criticisms of this guy, Excellency William Dershowitz, is that he diagnoses, but he doesn't offer a prescription for like how to make things better. Although I read some more interviews he did and everything, and he talks about somehow putting soul back in education, educating children's soul and not just their minds. And that's a lot about what David Brooks talks about. And I'll put a slide up, the road to character, and about how we're a culture that is very obsessed with resume virtues, but not very obsessed with eulogy virtues. The type of stuff that you put on a resume, but not the type of stuff that people talk about at your funeral. And he has a lot of insightful things to say in here. So I feel like being an expert in the Bible and Christianity and Jesus might have something to say into this crazy situation that we find ourselves living in. So the first thing I want to talk about after that kind of long introduction is how we got here, at least according to William Dershowitz, who, like I said, does a great job of kind of diagnosing the problem. And he talks about the history of college admissions and says, 100 years ago, the most selective colleges were basically an old boys club. A lot of them were single sex. And they really were more about catering to a certain culture than about academics. It was about what family you were from, where you'd been born. So they were much more regional than they are now. So if you're from close by, you had a better chance of getting in. The example he uses was that in the late 19th and early 20th century, there's a prep school in Massachusetts called Groton, and like 400 boys from Groton applied to Harvard, and 3 got rejected, which is no longer the case. But back then, it was about being the right kind of upper middle or upper class sort of strapping young man who knew how to fit in socially. Basically, it was a social thing. And then in the 50s, 60s, it really started to become about academic excellence. Because over the early 20th century, regional universities had become national universities, and regional elite had become conscious that they were really a national elite. And colleges started to see that if they were just catering to sort of this old boys club without much regard for academics, they weren't going to maintain their elite status. And so that's when things like the SAT get inserted, and grades and APs and all these sort of metrics that you have to meet. Now, the reason he tells those two stories is because he says the situation we're in right now is where it's not enough to sort of be the right kind of person, and it's not enough to have the right qualifications. You now have to do both. You now have to fit culturally in some sort of sense, and the criteria for what it means to fit culturally have changed, obviously, but you also have to have the perfect resume. You have to have the grades, you have to have the SAT scores, you have to have, double-digit number of APs and double-digit number of extracurriculars. And he said, whereas that bar may be, unbelievably high at the most selective elite universities, it's really not that much lower if you go to the second or third tiers. It's a trickle-down effect. So that even at ones that are not the most selective, you may not need a dozen APs, but you need 7 or 8. You may not need 10 extracurriculars, but you still get to have 5 or 6. And that has created the situation we find ourselves in, where kids basically have to be perfect. They have to be perfect, right? And it's way too much pressure. And there are consequences to this. And I love what he says here. Here's what he says about, he says a lot, but I like this little passage about the consequences for kids today. So extreme are the admission standards now, so ferocious the competition, that kids who manage to get into elite colleges have, by definition, never experienced anything but success. The prospect of not being successful terrifies them, disorients them, defeats them. They have been haunted by their whole lives. They've been haunted their whole lives by fear of failure, first instance by their parents' fear of failure. The cost of falling short, even temporarily, becomes not merely practical, but existential. So in other words, in order to check all these boxes that need to be checked to get into these colleges, it means that by definition, you've never failed. right? You've never gotten a bad grade. You've never not done well on your SAT. You've never gotten a 3 on an AP class, or you've never not, whatever it might be, because it just has to be that way if you've gotten into, these schools. And here's one of many results, is a violent aversion to risk. You have no margin for error, so you avoid the possibility that you will ever make an error. This is one of the reasons that elite education has become so inimical to learning. In other words, the two are incompatible. Education and learning are incompatible because there's no risk-taking involved. As Harry R. Lewis, the former Harvard dean, has written, nobody wants to take a chance on a class they might not ace, so nobody is willing to venture beyond the things they already know and do very well. Experimenting, exploring, discovering new ways to look at the world fall by the wayside, right? Because the fear of failure is so acute. And of course, that leads to things like anxiety, depression, hiding, because if you can't do with failure, you're not dealing with reality. Also conformity. The way he starts off this book is by talking about how so many people are going to the exact same professions. There's only a few different career paths that people want to take. They're not willing to take the risks. Now for parents, I love what he says here. Let's see if I can find it. While the overbearing upper middle class parent is a familiar figure now, there's a contradiction in the usual account. We all know about the helicopter parent, hovering, pressuring, criticizing, and about the kind of structured, supervised, skill-building childhood they superintend. The governing word is let's, as in let's practice your piano now. We also know about the overindulgent parent, the kind who lets their kids run wild in restaurants, who's still tying their shoelaces on their 8th birthday, who constantly tells them what wonderful, unique snowflakes they are, how they can be anything they want when they grow up, how they should do what they love and follow their dreams. The two parental styles are not, however, antithetical. They spring from a common impulse. Coddling and pushing, stroking and surveillance are both forms of overprotection. Each bespeaks a misguided belief that you can make the world safe for your children, that if only you do everything right, nothing will ever impede or harm them, that you can shield them, in the words of Peggy Orenstein, from pain or failure or sadness. Helicopter parenting, as Anna Quindlen has said, originates in the illusion of control. One might add that is a particularly middle-class form of that illusion, the idea that life can be rendered predictable, reduced to an orderly succession of achievements that will guarantee security and comfort. Pressuring your kids to get an A in calculus when they are 17 is essentially the same as tying their shoelaces for them when they are 8. I love that. Both are ways of treating them as if they can't do anything for themselves. Both, in other words, are forms of infantilization. Both kinds of parenting, finally, are forms of over-identification. The helicopter parent turns the child into an amusement of her will. The overindulgent parent protects his own need for limitless freedom and security. In either case, the child is made to function as an extension of somebody else. This is an essential fact of high-achievement parenting today. In The Price of Privilege, the clinical psychologist Madeline Levine speaks of parents, quote, who fill up their own brittle selves with their children's accomplishments. In The Pale King, David Foster Wallace has his narrator remark that, quote, it was a little bit like a for-profit company, my family, and that you were pretty much only as good as your last sales quarter. So I like that, the idea that pressuring your 17-year-old to get an A in calculus is the same thing as tying your shoelace for your 8-year-old, and that the tie between our children's achievements and our own sense of self-worth, right? They're filling up their own brittle selves, meaning parents, with their children's accomplishments. So there are consequences for parents, there are consequences for kids, and I've seen this, right? And I've felt this. Even when my 5th grader, for example, didn't get into St. John's, and my wife and I's feelings were really hurt. We're like, don't they like us? Haven't we done well there? And then we also are coming up with all sorts of rationalizations. Like, I think he did tell his interviewer he didn't want to go there because he wanted to go to Princeton. That may have had something to do with it, but maybe it didn't. Maybe he just didn't get in. And so this over-identification, this emotionality that comes along with our kids' accomplishments or lack thereof. Like I was visiting with a mom maybe a year ago, and she was really stressed out about her teenage daughter's classes, her 12-year-old. And finally I said, whose test is this? And because it was clear that it felt to her like it was her test, right? That her child's grades were a reflection of her worth as a parent. Or I remember when we were in New York City and our kids were in preschool. This is a little judgy, but whatever. I felt like I could tell the good parents because they let their 3-year-old wear a Giants jersey to school. Whereas like the kids who came in head to toe polo and like little cute patent leather shoes or white, but like that kid did not dress themselves, you know. And like I just love the parents that the kids because I don't know. We've just gone to private schools because we lived in places where the public schools weren't great. Um, I love the parents that let their kids show up and their hair's like, meh, and the socks didn't match, and just because it's like, who cares? They're kids, and clearly these parents were differentiated enough to not feel like their children were exclusively projections of themselves, of course. And I say this as someone who is totally guilty of this because I'm just like you, except you're better than me, so you're not like that. Um, I think there's also something to be said, and this is true in certain segments of the population, uh, that it's hard to be a type A parent with type B kids. Anyone experienced that before? We talk about how in our household, I'm a firstborn, my wife is a firstborn, our firstborn is a firstborn, our secondborn is not. you know, and he's very smart and very diligent and hardworking, but he just is more laid back. We sit down to dinner and the three of us wolf down our food in 15 minutes and we look over and he's like maybe a quarter of the way through. He's also far and away like the nicest person among us. With the baby, we had a miscarriage like 3 years ago, pretty late, like 14, 15 weeks, and it was hard. But my wife had a doctor's appointment coming up at about the same time, like 12, 13 weeks. And we told our boys, but we said, don't tell your friends because just in case, we don't want to kind of get the news out too much. And so my wife had the doctor's appointment. Everything was fine. The heartbeat was strong. Like, we're good to go. And we told our boys, like, if this is good, you can tell all your friends. So I go to pick up Jackson, our oldest, from school. Typical conversation. How was school? Good. How you doing? Good. Like nothing. And then we go to pick up my younger son from soccer, and he's on the soccer field at practice. He's in the middle of like a scrimmage. He stops what he's doing. He runs over to the car. He's in the chain link fence. Is the baby okay? Is the baby okay? I'm like, yes, the baby is okay. And he runs over to his friend and just tells his friend. That is all he'd been thinking about the entire day. My older son goes, my God, Spencer is so much better than I am. He's like, I did not give one thought to the baby today. All of which is to say he's just a different person, and there was a Wall Street Journal article about this about 10 years back, when type A parents have type B kids, because all these high-flying, high-powered, super crazy New Yorkers were having like, hey, what's up, like hair like me, type B kids, and they couldn't handle it. And they were trying to make them conform into that box, and it was creating a lot of problems. So I also thought it was interesting the other day talking about, because a lot of this is about us, right? It's not actually about our kids, it's about us. There was a study recently that, surprise, surprise, kids with depressed parents, their grades aren't as good. They're like 4 or 5 points lower than they would be. And all that is to say that if we want what's best for our kids, then we have to take care of ourselves. Right? We have to be healthy ourselves if we're going to take care of our kids. And at the same time, I don't know. We have our own issues. We have our own problems, right? And we don't, I think, need to pretend that we have it all together. That if we do live in a culture which has this sort of cult of happiness, then it's okay. Like I talk with, I do. My kids know I'm in therapy. I ask them questions sometimes based on that. I want them to know that it's okay to get help and that everything isn't always all right. I'll talk more about that in a sec. So yeah, this whole thing is as much about us and our projections and our emotions and our insecurities as it is about what our kids are experiencing in school. And I do think a large part of it, and you guys know this is why you're here, is getting our own heads right, getting our own hearts right, getting our own relationship with God right, so that we don't impose all this heaviness on our children. Okay, so how? How does this happen? Well, I have some thoughts. I'm going to start with a little video clip. I love that. Because what he's saying is that when you get to the top of the mountain, there's nothing there, right? That he clearly he's gone through something. You don't grow a beard like that unless you're going through something. It's like it's like Al Gore after the 2000 whatever it was. You remember that he came back? He had like the massive beard, the depression beard. Um, but what more could you have than what Jim Carrey has? Worldwide fame, notoriety, talent. I guess he's never won an Oscar. He probably should have for Truman Show. $20 million a picture. Like he has everything that anyone in his profession could ever want. He's scaled the mountain, reached the top, and there's nothing there. It's not enough to fill up the emptiness inside of him. And I think that is so helpful to remember when we're thinking about our own lives or our children's lives and all the effort we put in to trying to be something, to gain those credentials or to get that affirmation or that praise or that thing or whatever we think it is that's going to make everything okay. It's not. It's not going to make it okay. And the reason I have David Foster Wallace on here, for those of you that know him, very famous author. There was a movie that came out about him called The End of the Tour recently with Jesse Eisenberg and the guy who did The Muppets and who's in How I Met Your Mother. What's his name? Anyone? Jason Segel. Thank God you were here. Which is really good. He's an incredibly astute commentator on American culture. Here's something he says. He's so great at taking very abstract things and making them hugely profound. So he went on a cruise and he was not a fan. But here's what he says about cruises. The great lie of the ocean liner cruise is that enough pleasure and enough pampering will quiet the discontented part of you, when in fact, all it does is up the requirement. I can remember being 24 years old and having my, smiling mug in the New York Times book review, which to have your picture in the New York Times book review at 24, like, hello, right? And it feeling really good for exactly like 10 seconds. And then you're hungry for more. So that clearly, if you're not stupid, you figure out that the real problem is the discontented self. That all this stuff that you think will work for a second, but then all it does is set up a hunger for more and better. And that general pattern and syndrome seems to me to get repeated, at least in our culture, for our kind of plush middle-class part of the culture, over and over and over again in a million different arenas, and that we don't seem to get it. We do not seem to get it. Do you guys resonate with that at all? So what's a solution, a potential solution to that? Well, as I was thinking about that quote today, I just couldn't help of Jesus saying, "Come unto me, all ye that are weary and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." That's all I want, right? A little rest from this world. Like a little rest from the internal monologue, constantly crying out for more. Crying out, you're not good enough. Your kid's life is going to be a disaster and it's going to be your fault. Yeah, if I could, who said this? Gosh, I wish I thought this earlier. I could have looked it up. There's some quote about how the hardest thing to do in human existence is sit by yourself quietly in a room for 2 minutes. Isn't that true? It's like, oh my gosh, where's my phone? Quickly, where's my phone? I need my blog. Get me my phone. But that's true. I think that's why, to go in a totally different direction, why people find it so hard to pray. Because it either you just fall asleep immediately, because you're so exhausted, or your mind is just invaded by anxieties, right? All the things that you're trying to hold at bay with the phone or the NPR or the television or busyness or alcohol or whatever it is come flooding in. But of course, then it's an opportunity to say, here you go. Here's all this. Give it to you. Take it away. Jesus, God, you're in control, not me. It also made me think of John chapter 4, when Jesus meets the woman by the well and asks for a drink of water. And she's a Samaritan, so here's how this goes. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? Jews do not share things in common with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God And who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have no bucket, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us the well, and with his sons and his flocks drank from it?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but those who drink of the water that I will give them will never be thirsty. The water that I will give will become in them a spring of water gushing up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I may never be thirsty or have to keep coming here to draw water." And remember, she's the one who's been married like 5 times. And I don't know what her situation was, but if we use that as sort of a metaphor for our lives, how many different things have we tried to wed ourselves to, looking for the peace, the satisfaction, the living water that earthly things can't give us? And so what is that living water? I mean, I think it's tied to God's unconditional love and acceptance and forgiveness, and the knowledge that he is in charge and we are not, and that nothing we can do can change that. I think about Jesus' baptism when he comes up out of the water and God says, "This is my son, the beloved, and I'm very pleased with him." And I think that what Jesus says is that that's what God is saying to all of us. You're my son, you're my daughter, I love you, I'm pleased with you, I am with you. And that if we can hear that affirmation from the only voice that really matters, then it brings down the volume on the other voices. It doesn't eliminate them, because we're human beings, we live in this world, we live complicated lives. But to know, Warren Buffett said it. Someone asked him what the greatest lesson he'd ever learned was, and he said the power of unconditional love. And I don't think he's a Christian, but I think that's true. Knowing that you're loved, I think, is that water. It provides that peace. Knowing that God loves us, but more than that, knowing that God loves our children more than we do. Like, I think my wife said this once, and it was incredibly helpful, coming to an awareness that she was just our son's surrogate mother, that we're just surrogate parents, right? We're not the true parents. God is the true parent. And that can take a little bit of the pressure off, to know that ultimately they're his children. He's in control. He's in charge. This is his universe. Yes, he's given us a job to do, but the job is not to be him. I used to have this argument with a Christian friend of mine in New York, because he felt like it was his job to be God in his children's lives. And I was like, good luck, Whereas I felt like more it was my job to bear witness to God's love to my children. And part of that was telling them the truth about my own brokenness, apologizing to them. That came out of talking with a friend of mine in high school who I felt like really loved her father. And I said, "What makes your dad a good dad?" And she said, "One of the things is he's willing to say sorry to me. He's willing to admit when he's done something wrong." And to me, that bears witness to a forgiving, loving God, and sort of points in that direction, rather than being like, "Here, no, look here, no, look there," because that's my only hope, and that's your only hope too. So God loves you. God loves your kids. Jesus talks a lot about not worrying, about living one day at a time. Each day has enough trouble of its own. I do think a lot of our anxiety arises from what AAers called living in the wreckage of the future. Imagining like all the bad things that could happen. Whereas if you just, if we think about today, right now, here we are, we're all breathing, we had a nice lunch, we're amongst friends, praise God. Who knows what'll happen tomorrow, but we'll jump off that bridge when we come to it, right? That there's a lot of peace to be found in living today and not worrying too much about the future. And so when I think about that, I think about the Jim Carrey clip and the David Foster Wallace quote. I'm struck by, and we know this is true, but the emptiness of achievement and the peace that comes with living today in light of God's love. Like, I think that can actually be helpful. That if we remind ourselves we're loved, forgiven, accepted, God's in control, he loves our children, he knows what he's doing. I'm going to focus on today and not worry too much about, 4 years from now or whatever. I I think that'll start to work on us, and I think that that'll be helpful for our kids too, right? To be communicating that kind of message. Okay, second thing I want to say, I'm going to show another clip. How are we doing on time? What time do we go to? 1:30? Okay, so um, this is Conan O'Brien speaking at the 2011 Dartmouth class commencement. It's about a 24-minute speech. The first 15 are like exclusively jokes. They're really good. So I encourage you to go home and watch those, but we don't have time for all the jokes. So we're going to start here, and he's at a part in his speech where he's addressing the parents, and then he'll say some pretty profound things. We'll talk about those, and then we'll be just about done. So Conan O'Brien, 2011. Well, first of all, I just want to say, the cynical person could say, and I could say, well, okay, but still, like, he's Conan O'Brien, right? He went to Harvard, like, he makes millions of dollars a year. But that, as I was thinking about that today, I was reminded of the first church I ever worked at, this large Presbyterian church in kind of suburban California outside San Francisco. Still very self-righteous, still very, Berkeley. And I went to go talk to my senior pastor. He just wanted to meet with me. And I said, gosh, how can you work here? Everyone has so much money and they don't care and they're not committed to the world, and terrible. And he looks at me, he's like, RJ, you have two problems. One is that you have no respect for people. And the second is that you still think money matters. And he was right? Because as much as Conan O'Brien had, I have no doubt that, can you imagine getting kicked off the Tonight Show? Like the existential crisis that would bring along, especially when for 20 years, you've been going on this career path, and how public it was. And I've failed, but I haven't failed in front of hundreds of millions of people. But what I do want to say, and I think what he wants to say too, and I think that this is hopefully a unique thing to say, failure is good. Failure is so good. In fact, I would say, and this I do think is uniquely Christian, failure is the way that God works. Failure is the way that God shapes us into the people he wants us to be. It's the way he makes us like Jesus. One of my favorite biblical passages comes from Romans chapter 8. It's Paul talking. And of course, Paul experienced extreme failure. He had everything going. He went to all the best schools. He had the best, he was a citizen. He came from a wealthy family. He had everything. And he gave up everything to follow Jesus because he says, everything I had before was total rubbish. And the word he uses is actually a 4-letter word, which I won't say here, compared to knowing Jesus. But he writes in Romans chapter 8, the creation has been subjected to futility, not of its own will, but of the will of the one who created it, in the hopes that we would be liberated from our bondage to decay and enter into the freedom of the glorious children of light. In other words, things fall apart. That's the way God made it. And it's that way in the hopes of setting us free from things down here and encouraging us to cling to things up there, things that are eternal, things that matter, and not things that pass away. And that failure is the way that God creates, Paul also talks about the fruits of the Spirit within us. Because what we want for ourselves and for our children is success, is happiness, is, and I get that. That's what I want for myself. That's what I want for my kids. My God, I'm because I love them. But remember what the fruits of the Spirit are: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness. Those are the things that God cares about. Compassion, faith, hope, love. And the only way those things get created are through suffering. It's just true. Think about your own lives. Think about the people that you trust the most, the people that you go to when the chips are down. I guarantee you there are people that have gone through some hard things, and the fruits of the Spirit have been born out of that. Now, not always. It can also make you bitter and resentful and all that sort of stuff. But there's something about suffering, there's something about failure that is so good. And that's Jesus's life, right? Look at Jesus. Like he was a he was a failure. He died alone on a cross, miserable death. Now God raises him from the dead, but he's not living. He wasn't living his best life now. As he's hanging on the cross. Or as I've also said, when you look at lives in the Bible, lives of love, lives that God are invested in, tend to be kind of downwardly mobile, not upwardly mobile. And yet, what does Jesus say? The last shall be first, and the first shall be last. There's something very upside down about God's kingdom. And yet, again, it's not, it jives with our experience. That when we know people in our lives who are loving and joyful and patient and peaceful and kind and all those things we want, they're probably not people who sort of have it all in the eyes of the world. They're probably people who've gone through some stuff, or even if they do, like Conan O'Brien. He's still successful. He still got his own TV show. He's still on TBS. I still love him. He's not at the pinnacle. He's doing okay, but there's a kindness and a wisdom that is infused into his personality as a result of the failure he has suffered. And I'll say, I've experienced this. Some of you know that the only reason we ended up in Houston is because we were planting a church in New York City and it failed. And that was like the hardest thing, The two hardest things that have ever happened to me were the failure of the church, which was like the destruction of our life in New York, the death of a dream, the death of who I thought I was. We almost went bankrupt. Like it was brutal. My kids like crying and screaming for a whole weekend because they didn't want to, it was not pretty. And then we got here, and about 2 days after we arrived, my wife turns to me, she goes, "Thank God we are here. This was not our plan, but it was his plan. And he knew what he was doing." And now I can talk about failure a little bit. And I know that, and as he said, there's nothing more liberating than having your worst fear realized. So that, and then also the miscarriage was incredibly hard. But I also, even as that was happening, I felt, one of the promises in the Bible, God, in the Old Testament, God says, "I will take your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." And I could feel him kind of working on my heart of stone and turning it into a heart of flesh, making me a little bit more into a human being, making me a little bit more, I don't know, sensitive and compassionate or something. And I had the thought as I was driving down the road about a week after, I was like, suffering is the way God makes us more like Jesus. It just is. And I hate that, and I wish it wasn't true, but it is true. And David Brooks talks about that. That's why this is up, about how, again, the resume virtues versus the eulogy virtues, or he talks about Adam 1 versus Adam 2. And he says Adam 1 is all about worldly success, but Adam 2 is about wisdom and compassion, the things which make life worthwhile. And those things only happen through failure and learning. And as we're thinking about that, we're thinking about our kids, and this is where it's hard. This is where the rubber meets the road. One of my buddies, who's the rector of the Cathedral Church of the Advent in Birmingham, Episcopal Church, he doesn't talk about helicopter parents. He talks about snowplow parents. A lot of snow in Houston. But for those of you who've never seen snow, just kidding. The truck that goes before that's like, just clearing the path. And that's what we want to do, right? We want to clear the path for our children to make their way as easy and joyful and successful as possible. And yet, if what Conan O'Brien says is true and what Paul says is true, we have to ask ourselves the question, if we're, to the degree that we're snow plowing, are we actually working against God? Like if we actually want our kids to be loving, joyful, peaceful, patient, kind, then we need to let them fail, right? It's also just part of like letting them grow up. A lot of the criticism that he has, I said it before, the infantilization of our children, the kids that go away to school have never experienced failure, have never had their parents not snow plowing for them, they're not adults. And so are we letting our kids fail and learn and grow? Are we letting God do his work on them? Now, he's going to do it no matter what, but are we delaying the process? Are we, are we engaging in God's work, or are we working against him? And I will say, because I was thinking about this in my own therapy recently, about how I was, I went to 10 different schools before college. My dad was ambitious. We moved around a lot. I was the first child. My dad was away working. I think I was the locus for a lot of my mom's anxieties and hopes and dreams. And in some ways, I feel like I don't want to say I wasn't allowed to fail, but something like that. I didn't experience failure for quite a while. And so it made me think, like with my son, and I asked him when I picked him up that day, I said, hey, do me and mom let you fail? Like, do you feel like we're always rescuing you? Uh, and I was deeply thankful for his answer. He said, Dad, it's not even a question. He's like, you guys give me a lot of space. And you let me do my thing, and you let me experience, you let me experience the consequences of my actions. He said, you guys are far and away the least hovering parents of anyone in my grade. And I was like, praise God. Then we got home, and I was like, hey, Jack, tell mom what you just told me. And I was like, oh yeah, I told Dad that you guys care less than any other parents in my class. It's like, wait a minute, that's how I involve. I mean, you're less involved than any parents in my class. And he was like, that doesn't sound right. But we knew what he meant, So somehow, by the grace of God, he at least feels like we've given him the space. And yet, part of that has been like, well, you're just in eighth grade, and your grades don't matter. But next year, your grades are going to matter. And it's going to be hard in high school, right? As he gets this, it goes on his permanent record. And he starts compiling this GPA for college. And so it's going to be an ongoing battle. And some of you guys are in that or have been, or I don't know. But that's something we need to think about what God's priorities are and what our priorities are, right? Because God's priority is not even that it's not that our kids be successful in the worldly sense. It's not even that our kids be, what was I going to say, be good. Christianity is not really about morality. It's not. As again, my old seminary dean used to say, Christianity is a system not for making people good, but for helping people deal with the fact that they aren't good. But that God's objective is not success or goodness, it's faith. And the thing that creates faith most often is failure. Right? When you come to the end of yourself, because there are really, at the end of the day, only two ways to live. One is, it's all up to me. I got to raise my kids right. I got to make sure they get the good grades. I got to make sure they go to the right school. I got to make sure they have the right connections and get the right job and move to the right place and are in the right community. And, it's all up to me and it's all up to them. And that will destroy you. That's this. That's suicide on campus and the pressure of perfection. It's all up to me. But the second way to live is it's all up to God. And that is the freedom that Jesus invites us into. Do not worry about what you will eat or drink or wear. Your heavenly Father knows you need these things, but seek him and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. It's an invitation to, it is a commandment, but it's also an invitation. Like, I've got this. And the more we can live like that, encourage our kids to live like that, paradoxically, I do sort of think the more happy and successful they're going to be, actually, and they're going to spend a lot less on therapy in 20 years, getting over how controlling we were or how we rescued them from failure, how they don't have the resources to deal with the disappointments of life. Because life is, you can't, we cannot save our children no matter how hard we try. And the reason is because God has set up the world in such a way that no one gets out of here without failing, because it's through failure that our hearts are turned towards him. Like, that's his system, So, yeah, that's really about it. Is that my last slide? I think that's about it. If I was to summarize, I want to take a little Q&A. I don't know. We live in a tough culture. There's a lot of pressures on us. There's a lot of messages. Some of it is imagined. Some of it is real. But at the end of the day, I do have to believe, I love what Jim Carrey said. If you blow up the entire universe, you'd never find any of us or our culture. There's great freedom in smallness, and knowing that God is in charge, we are not. This life is short, eternity is long, and that whatever happens to us, whatever happens to our kids, there's going to be success, there's going to be failure, but God holds us in the palm of our hand. And I do believe, because I'm a Christian, that someday we're going to be sitting around in heaven and we're going to say, man, I burned a lot of energy worrying about things that just really did not matter at all. And then we'll let it go and we'll forget about it and we'll just, go scuba diving or, whatever you like to do, go play tennis or something forever and ever, and we'll never get injured. And that sounds awesome. So yeah. Well, let me pray real fast and then I'll take some questions. Lord, anything I've said that's of you, may it stick. If it's not, may it pass away. Help us in our own lives and in our parenting to trust you and to find peace and hope and joy because we know that you are in charge and we are not, thank God. Um, Amen.